Hello and welcome to this next episode of the Akkad and Koka Report. I'm Michel Akkad in San Francisco, and my co-host Anish Koka is joining us from Philadelphia. In the eye of the public, and certainly in the eye of the government, American physicians are represented by one prominent organization, namely the American Medical Association. In point of fact, however, only a minority of American physicians currently belong to the AMA, which nevertheless continues to hold a privileged position when it comes to negotiating with the federal government on the design of healthcare policy, on setting physician fees for the Medicare and Medicaid programs, and on taking influential positions on matters of medical ethics, and so forth. But who should represent physicians when doctors may hold very divergent views on matters of politics, economics, ethics, and even medical science as well? Should there be one voice or a plurality of voices? To discuss this topic, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Jane Orient, who is the Executive Director of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, or AAPS. Dr. Orient obtained her medical degree from Columbia University and trained in internal medicine in Dallas and Tucson, and she's been in solo practice in Tucson, Arizona since then. She's a prolific writer, having penned hundreds of op-eds in national and local media outlets. She's the author of numerous books, notably Your Doctor Is Not In, Healthy Skepticism About National Health Care, and Sutton's Law, a novel about where the money is in medicine. She is also the editor of the famous textbook Sapira's Art and Science of Bedside Diagnosis. Dr. Orient, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's a great honor to speak to you.
Thank you. We're delighted to have you. I thought we'd start by having you tell us about the APS and how it started. It's an organization that's been around for a long time. Can you tell us what started it? What was its mission at the beginning, and perhaps it is still its mission today?
Well, its mission hasn't changed. It started in 1943, at the time that the Wagner-Murray-Dingle bill was being promoted in Congress. That was one of the first attempts to socialize medicine in the United States. And the APS was formed by a group of doctors who thought the AMA was not doing its job. The AMA was not advocating for physicians politically. And so AAPS was founded to fill in the breach. And then after AAPS started fighting Wagner-Murray-Dingle, the AMA jumped into the battle and decided that it was going to be the political voice of physicians. But we still feel that the AMA is not doing its job. It pretends to speak with one voice, but that's really the voice of its business interests, because it really has its huge building and all of its resources because of selling the CPT codes, with which it has an exclusive copyright arrangement with the government.
Sure,
so
those are the codes that essentially dictate everything in medicine. The codes that doctors have to use when they submit a bill to any insurance company. But to go back to that bill you mentioned that was passed, what was it was the first attempt at passing a national healthcare system. What was that bill about?
It was about national health insurance, and it was defeated. And then it eventually came back in the form of Medicare, just for the over 65 population, thinking that would be easier to get through. And the AMA at first fought that, but then when it appeared they were losing that battle, they introduced elder care, which was because they wanted to get their piece of the action. Instead of just the hospitals getting government money, they wanted the physicians to get government money for their fees too. And so this started the beginning of the cost spiral, the inexorable rise in costs. Maybe medical charges from hospitals doubled or tripled in the year after Medicare was passed.
Right, for sure. So AAPS has continued since then, and to try to be a voice, an alternative voice to the AMAs. What is its position today, would you say, for APS? I mean, what is the main mission? Go ahead.
The main mission, I believe, is to preserve and promote private medicine. And this is just not mean exactly the same thing as private practice, because a lot of people who are in private practice and that they own their building and things like that, they are getting paid by third-party payers, the government, Medicare, Medicaid, and third-party insurance companies. And that the insurance company is paying the physician directly instead of reimbursing the patient the way insurance companies traditionally did. So a lot of doctors are totally enmeshed in this managed care third-party payment system, and a private medicine means the physician is working for the patient, and so he does what the patient needs, what he believes is best for the patient, instead of trying to satisfy his employer, who is, after all, the person who's writing the check.
Right. And that's really the crux of the problem. But are patients culpable in a way of enabling the system?
Well, I think that yes, they are. Many of them have accepted the idea that they are entitled to get free medical service. They think that because they paid their taxes or because their employer is paying for their insurance, then that it's the responsibility of these other people to take care of them. And so a lot of them are really resistant to paying their medical bills, even their co-payments. And they don't realize that by accepting this money from the third party, they have really given up their right to make their own decisions.
Right. What are the activities that the APS is engaged in to try to promote private practice the way you've defined it?
Well, we have action alerts, and we advise people on actions that they can take to inform their Congress about upcoming legislation. We have press releases. Maybe our biggest action right now is to litigate. We fought against Obamacare from about 3 days after it was passed. We filed a lawsuit against Obamacare, and we are still trying to educate the Congress that this really needs to be repealed. But in the meantime, we have supported all variety of court cases to try to mitigate the effects, even if we can't get it declared totally unconstitutional.
Right.
Jane, how did you come to where you are in APS? Did you right off the bat know that the conventional medical organizations weren't speaking for you, or what was your journey?
I was a VA doctor for about 5 years, and I wrote some articles for medical journals, like an answer to the American College of Physicians, A Marxist View of Medical Care, because I was really alarmed that the American College of Physicians was virtually calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government and its replacement by a Marxist system. And I found out that the contract I'd signed said, well, I really couldn't work for the government if I was going to be criticizing the government. The Annals of Internal Medicine, of course, rejected my article. It appeared in pieces in other places like the Foundation for Economic Education, little booklet called The Freeman. And then APS called me one day to request permission to reprint. And I said, sure, I'd be delighted to have my article reprinted, but who are you? And after I went to my first meetings, I just really couldn't stay away. It was so exciting to meet with other doctors who were fighting for their patients, who were fighting to remain independent, and who understood the terribly destructive effect that the third-party system, particularly the government, has on their relationship with their patients.
So go ahead, Anisha.
So that was that was about so you left the VA, but I guess you already had a very strong ideology about. It sounds like even working for the VA, you were agitating, if you will, for against, I guess, more greater government control or whatnot. Makes me wonder why you wanted to work for the VA in the first place.
Well, I got that job offered to me as part of it. I was also on the faculty of the University of Arizona College of Medicine, and so we were doing research, and it sounded really nice, academics, and I thought, well, the veterans, after all, do have some claim on medical care, since that was part of the deal. But I found out that I was a gatekeeper, and that my job really was to kick veterans out if they didn't have a service-connected disability, or they weren't, if they didn't need immediate admission. And I found that really to take care of the patient, you had to kind of bend the rules. Like if you made an appointment for them to see you the next day to see whether their asthma attack was getting better, this was a violation of the rules. You weren't supposed to do that. This was very frustrating. I mean, I just felt, how can you feel good about practicing medicine when you're treating patients like that?
Do you think that do you see any upsides to what happened in 19? I mean, are there any upsides to Medicare? Any upsides to Medicaid? Any upsides to the third-party payment system?
I can't think of any. I think that it's made people dependent on a system that's corrupting, that destroys the patient-physician relationship, that gives everybody a vested interest in trying to game the system instead of trying to do what's best. I just think it's evil, and particularly in its managed care, which is taking over everything, including most of Medicaid and the Medicare Advantage plans. And free market advocates, supposed free market advocates, can't even see the difference. I mean, they seem to think that that's the free market.
Do you think it comes from a place of evil? Do you think it, in terms of the motivations for it? Like, do you think they're just folks that are deluded, or you think they know what they're doing, or?
Oh, I think most doctors who are involved in it are really trying to do their job, and they think they have to do it because otherwise they won't have any patients. And sometimes they don't have any patients. The patients think that they
I mean the folks that are pushing, that pushed for Medicare, the folks that pushed for Medicaid. Do you think these are folks? I'm talking about the policy folks. I mean, most of us are grunts working in the system, trying to do the best we can for patients, as you're saying. But the folks that push for Medicare, the folks that push for Medicaid, what are their motivations are?
Well, I think they're smarter than everybody else, and they like being in control, and they figure that if only they ran the system, it would be very good. And I just think that they enjoy their power, and they have a vested interest in money that flow. I mean, not this huge amount of money flowing through the system.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's certainly one possibility. But do you think? I mean, whenever we look at different societies, or even history of the United States or whatnot, there always seems to be a desire from many folks, from society, to want to try to take care of folks that cannot receive care, or are indigent, or are have a rare condition. Meaning, it's almost that there seems to be a desire in most societies to kind of have a state-based apparatus to take care of those who are unable, for whatever reason, to take care of themselves.
Well, of course, there are people who have charitable motivations, and I think all physicians should feel some responsibility to help people that they can help. But it's one thing to do it charitably, and another thing to rob people and skim off a big share of the money and to run it all through a government bureaucracy. That charity care is still very wonderful, and in many cases it's really being displaced by Medicaid and by government entitlement, instead of being freely given, in which everybody benefits, including the people who were giving the care.
Right. I really wonder whether part of the problem is that you have groups of folks that are looking to have a bad outcome for whatever reason. So, and these are frequently in the minority. So these are orphan diseases, say. That's a good example where if the government were not to say, hey, we will pay X amount of dollars for these patients to be taken care of, that is that signals to the market. That signals to private entities, that signals to a variety of different players that there's value in trying to take care of these folks. So I really wonder, and I don't know that there's going to, this is all speculation, but is it possible that, the fact that we went from spending 5% of the GDP on healthcare to spending, now 18% of GDP on healthcare, and yes, there's a lot of waste there, but within that massive increase in the amount of federal dollars that were outlaid to take care of patients, there was certainly a very, very big carrot that was created, and certainly the massive innovation you've seen since the 1960s, since this massive pool of dollars was kind of thrown out there. It's certainly plausible, don't you think, that those dollars drove much of the innovation that you see? We can argue about whether the innovation is in the right mode, meaning should we be creating this many oncologic drugs, and while there are other diseases that kind of languish, But is it not the case that if you spend, if the nation says we're going to spend X trillions of dollars over the next 50 years on trying to cure cancer, or et cetera, that you will then get, the massive innovation that we've kind of seen? Is that not one positive?
Well, I think that what has happened is the government has taken over funding for research, and it dominates research. And you may say, well, look at all these wonderful innovations we have, but you don't see is what would have happened had we not had all of the resources monopolized by the government and by their peer reviewers, which have just sort of a human dislike of changing things, or of looking at ideas that were not their ideas to start with. I mean, look at the computer industry. We didn't have Medicare for the computer industry, and I think the computer industry is way ahead of the medical industry in innovation. And a lot of the things that came to the medical industry, like the CT scan, that came from somebody's garage. It didn't come from the government pouring money in.
That's true, Jane. But the problem is that the market for a personal computer is, some 200 million people that can fork over X number of dollars in the richest country in the world. Folks that are born with, tetralogy of Fallot, there may be, a couple thousand, and that market is very small. There's no Apple type company, Hewlett Packard type company that is going to spend a massive amount of money on those 1,000, 2,000 people per year. So there's frequent comparison between IT and healthcare, but they're two very different things. The market for iPhones is massive. It's global. I mean, and of course the United States is the biggest market, but iPhones, everyone, that market, everyone can buy an iPhone, but not everyone needs a congenital heart operation. Not everyone needs a lung cancer. Not everyone has stage 4 lung cancer and needs a specific, treatment for that. Those are folks that would be let go, essentially, in a world that you're talking about.
Well, I don't think so. I think that the people who figured out how to fix tetralogy of Fallot were not the government. They were physicians who were very dedicated to their patients. They're wonderful charitable institutions that were developed, like the Shriners Burn Centers and so on, to treat these things. And I don't think it's correct at all to say that babies with congenital heart disease will be dying without the government helping them.
Right. I tend to agree with you, Jane. But even if we, for the sake of the argument, conceded Anisha's point that certain conditions have been improved or helped by money being directed by the government in a certain way, there's always a cost, because the money comes out from from somewhere else, and now it's clearly everybody's hurting from these massive expenditures that are driving the prices through the roof, and you have an entire generation that is either completely dependent, completely being dispossessed, because the money for healthcare has the cost of healthcare has become so high that they're so dispossessed, and the government is bankrupt. I mean, it's if this bankruptcy that is harming people in a way that are hard to put in the accounting, because if the money it's conceivable that in a way a lot of poverty that's still lingering in the country is in effect tied to this hugely centralized scheme. And so if people with tetralogy of Fallot are getting saved because but on the other hand homeless people are dying because they their education is going down the tubes and whatnot, it's all tied. So you can't, it's an impossible calculus to get right. You can point to a benefactor of government largesse. You might say, yes, look, we made a program and these people have been saved. You can point to it, but that doesn't tell you the whole story.
Well, of course not, but what's happening, what the government is doing now, that it's bankrupt and that medical care costs perhaps 10 times as much as it otherwise would. Well, they're figuring out ways to cut off care to disabled children or disabled older people, and ration the care so that most the visible care goes to people who are voting and paying taxes, and taking it away from people that are the neediest in society. If you have something that's grounded on theft, that requires some morally superior agency with guns backing it up to take the money from people who earned it and distribute it in a way that pleases them, and that, by the way, pleases the special interest groups that are there raking off the profits, then you think that you're going to have something that it benefits the neediest? I mean, I don't think so. Look at what we've got. We have more needy, we have more homeless people, we have rationing, we have quality adjusted life years deciding who's going to get treatment and who isn't.
Yeah, so the problem seems to be cronyism, meaning cronyism in that, it seems like we have massively misaligned incentives, and we have a lot of dollars going into places that shouldn't be going. I mean, the system has been gamed up the wazoo, and, we're incredibly inefficient in terms of how we spend dollars. Doesn't seem to be much doubt about that, that's for sure.
Well, when you have the government in control of it, and it has so much power, then this is what you see. If you have a discipline of a free marketplace where people are spending their own money, they are not going to be.
Would you be opposed to a system where the government did certain targeted things, like say there's a disease that afflicts 1,000 people a year, and we use tax dollars to say we will create a fund that essentially pays for this group of people? Is it possible to kind of do this piecemeal, Jane? Meaning, can we? It seems like a lot of times the choices are we have to have a completely government control system where they set all the prices and they decide what can be done. They decide how many doctors there are, how many MRIs there are, or we have a completely different system with no government involvement at all, where if you have a local group of folks that need something, it's up to them through charity to raise it, and through churches and other religious whatever, GoFundMe, whatever. But is there some happy medium that we could arrive at, where the government, say, paid for catastrophic insurance, or there was a national plan to pay for catastrophic insurance, or there was a way to have targeted approaches? Say the government put aside billions of dollars a year for research on muscular dystrophy, because that's too small of a market by itself to support private research, perhaps. Is that possible?
Well, the government, remember, doesn't have any money. It's the taxpayers. Money is being taken from the taxpayers. And why do you think that the government bureaucrats are better at figuring out where the money should go than the taxpayer? Now, why couldn't we have something like charitable organizations that pay people's medical bills, and people get a tax credit for giving money to the charitable organization, which then decides where the money should go? I mean, the government has already targeted AIDS, and it's targeted muscular dystrophy, and it's cancer, and billions of dollars are flowing into that, and we still have these diseases, and the government decides what things get funded and what doesn't. What if we had grants to scientists who had made advances before and say, hey, okay, here's your $10 million. We're going to go away. You figure it out.
Because it requires, but it's specifically because it requires these groups. Like the AIDS example the AIDS story is a great example of the fact that, do you really want the HIV/AIDS community in the 1980s, with all the stigmas associated with it, attempting to fundraise for themselves? It seems, it seems what happened, which was essentially the government finally becoming aware of the problem, and the government devoting a lot of resources to trying to solve the problem. Meaning, I'm sure you don't have a problem with the government, or I don't know, maybe you do. Do you have a problem with the government expending a vast amount of resources in 3 or 4 years to try to send somebody to the moon? Meaning, is that necessarily a bad thing for us to ask of our government?
Well, you could say that something like the moonshot, that was a pioneering thing that involved the whole country sort of vicariously in a great exploratory project. Whereas, all right, AIDS, the government directs where all that money goes. There are no alternate hypotheses that can even be talked about or considered. If you don't believe what's going on in the AIDS research, you're not going to get a grant to do it a different way. The way that we're doing it, it hasn't solved the problem yet. Why can't we have some other sources of funding? Well, because the government has a total monopoly on research.
Well, nothing is stopping. What is stopping? There's tons of private equity, tons of venture capital that's also doing. What's stopping venture capital and private equity from researching other techniques for dealing with HIV. By the way, the AIDS story does seem to be a success story in that you can live a normal life now with AIDS. Which even when I was starting medical school, there was a significant amount of fear related to AIDS, which now seems to be completely gone. But I hear what you're saying. You're saying that we're focused. Your point is we're focused only on highly active antiretroviral therapies and really haven't looked at other things. But I would push back and say that, hey, there's tons of private equity funding that could fund labs looking at alternative ways to deal with HIV.
Well, if they weren't paying so much in taxes, which is all being diverted into what the government wants to do, then there would be more money available to do something else.
Plus, there's a crowding out effect. If the government is involved in the funding of a certain industry, it's very hard for the private sector to come in and compete, because the government is not held to the same discipline of the market, because the government will continue to raise and pour more funds, whereas the private entities will have deadlines, have limited funds. I mean, they're making entrepreneurial decisions that the government doesn't make. But I want to go back, go back a little bit to the question of representing the physicians and the voice of the physicians. I mean, I think we all agree here that the government in general tends to mess things up, and it seems that the AMA at least has decided to play the game, to be embedded in that whole system. We know that they take advantage of it, and it's the case with most professional organizations that do represent physicians, whether they're specialty groups and whatnot. The APS is still relatively small, Jane. Do you have a hard time convincing doctors of your view? And so what's the challenge there?
Well, I think a lot of doctors have given up. They are so demoralized. They are saying, I can't be an independent practice anymore. The government regulations are so crushing. The expenses are so great. The managed care companies will pay for certain things. If something has a CPT code and gets reimbursed, it gets paid for taking time, spending time with the patient. You don't get paid. And doctors are saying, well, I'm going to get a job, and if I have a job, I don't dare join an organization like APS because my employers may disapprove. And so they've just decided they're going to be marking time until they retire. And, a lot of them are shooting themselves or otherwise committing suicide because their life has become such a battle.
Right. Let me. We had a show on this, and I'll put that. I'll link to it in the show notes. We had an episode on the epidemic of physician suicide and how it might be precisely tied to this very demoralizing and dehumanizing system. But tell us a little bit about how APS is doing these days in terms of recruitment and getting the name out, and whether is it primarily that inertia that you feel that, I mean, most physicians coming out of medical school are expecting to become employed in big box big box medicine and so forth, and
well, I think the medical schools are actually hostile to the idea of doctors having an independent practice. And even the Benjamin Rush Institute, which holds debates, has difficulty getting many medical colleges to even allow them to occur. Most medical students don't even realize that there's another possibility, and they are so burdened by debt that they really have to think about trying to get that reliable paycheck. They can't afford to sit in their office and wait for somebody to come consult them. But more and more doctors are breaking out of the system, even some of them coming directly out of residency or fellowship, and we have seminars several times a year. We have one coming up in Dallas on February 22nd of doctors who have declared independence. They are working for their patients. They are free to innovate. They are free to spend time with their patients, find out what's really bothering them. But like for something, if you have a new treatment or something for AIDS or for something else, traumatic brain injury in veterans, if the government, the Medicare program, the Medicaid program, which really dominate other insurers' decisions too, will not pay for it, then basically it becomes unavailable because these very sick patients often can't afford to pay for it. But the insurance company decided, well, we're going to pour billions of dollars into this treatment, even though it doesn't work very well. And if you have something that's not on our list or on our protocol, forget it.
Right. This push towards standardization of everything, and this the fact that most doctors now are very afraid of to experiment, but I use experiment not in the sense of experimenting without consent or doing something dangerous or whatnot, but trying different things for conditions that don't have any really good treatment. Right, most doctors now are trained to throw their hands up in the air and not try anything new. When in fact, there's a lot to be learned from trying trial and error. In fact, most innovation, most discoveries comes from that. But do you think that APS has, because it's open to this idea of more alternative ways of thinking about treatment, that also is sort of stigmatizing in a way when most students are essentially in a way indoctrinated through medical school of thinking in very standardized ways about medicine and health and so forth.
Well, it is, and for example, with veterans who have traumatic brain injury, a lot of them have gotten a whole lot better with hyperbaric oxygenation, which is accepted for like diving injury and so on, but many physicians will not even consider it for an off-label indication, even no matter how many hundreds of patients say, you saved my life, these backpacks full of drugs that the VA was giving me were just making me depressed, and 22 of them a day commit suicide. Still, so many doctors are either afraid that somebody will say something bad about them, or the medical board will come after them, or they've just been taught that if it's not in the protocol that I've been taught, then it's not scientific and it's quackery and I can't even think about it. It's really quite discouraging when you see all these patients who need somebody to think outside the box, because the things that we have on the protocol just don't help.
But Jane, how do we then separate out how do we separate ourselves from chiropractors and naturopaths? And meaning there are many different things that, and there are hundreds and hundreds of chiropractors, patients who've been seen by chiropractors that say that their hearts are healthier because of the spinal manipulation that has happened. Meaning these are things that stretch the bounds of what we think is plausible. Aren't you opening up? I mean, how do we? So just simply the fact that you have hundreds of patients that say that this made them better, that's fine. Then, but there's no onus on any third-party payer to pay that. Then, if they want to pay for hyperbaric oxygen, let them pay for hyperbaric oxygen, and you can go ahead and administer it outside of the bounds of it, outside of the bounds of whatever payment system is linked up here. So, but how do we separate ourselves? Yeah,
freedom is a very dangerous thing. People making choices for themselves, they sometimes make mistakes.
Yeah.
But we just don't have any perfect way of judging things in medicine. And so we want to say, well, we're much smarter than the patient, so we're going to say, well, this is going to help your heart and this other thing isn't going to help your heart. And so we're going to pay for certain things, we're not going to pay for other things. And you've got to have people willing to invest millions and millions in a double-blind controlled experiment, which really is so appropriate for some things like drug trials and so on, but not for other things. But if a treatment isn't suited for that, then it's no good, or it's quackery. And I don't think we're going to make progress that way. Instead, we're just going to be enriching the special interests who have always been doing the same way. I think with freedom, we have to be willing to take risks. And if a patient is going to a chiropractor and feeling better, who are you to say that they should be going to a doctor who doesn't make them feel better, who gives them drugs that will have side effects and that cost money and so on? I mean, who are you to decide that for the patient?
Oh, no,
Maybe
no.
the patient would be better no matter maybe better off doing nothing, and maybe the chiropractor's doing them a favor by keeping him from things that would hurt him.
Right. So, no, I guess then, I mean, naturopaths have all sorts of different concoctions that they give that says that that cures the cold and cures the flu and whatnot. But
well, I don't have anything that cures the cold and cures the flu.
right.
But maybe they don't either. But
right, they don't either. Yeah. So I mean, so isn't it? No, they're free to go to them. But my point is that how do you put limits on the? I mean, I guess you're arguing that we shouldn't have limits as physicians, but
I'm not arguing that. I mean,
yeah.
the government has a role in preventing fraud.
Yeah.
And if you're making claims that are that you're lying and that
right.
are disprovable and so on, well, then that's fraud, like in any other type of industry. But the government shouldn't be setting itself up as the sole expert that will overrule.
Right. I think there are two limits. The two limits are, one is the ethical stance that you take as a physician. And that's probably the most important thing that differentiates you from the quack. If you're going to, say the way Hippocrates taught us, 2,500 years ago, that, these are my principles, I'm going to, abide by them, I'm going to do what's right for the patient, that sort of thing. That's very, very important. And that, of course, has been dismissed and is dismissed and relegated to, to the dustbin in a government-run healthcare system. That's number one. And number two is your medical school. What medical school did you come from? What training did you get? And that stays with you. And the medical schools should be, should be giving the imprimatur of the kind of doctor that you are and you're going to be. And with those two things, I think that's what differentiates, the doctors and the physicians from the rest.
Well, let me just say that at Columbia, the renal specialist did not approve of hemodialysis. And you could not get hemodialysis at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. If your kidneys did not recover from acute renal failure, you died unless you could get into the dialysis department at Delafield Hospital up the street. And I think Columbia did come around to say, well, okay, maybe hemodialysis is okay. But even our most expert institutions have been known to be desperately wrong. Oh, yes, we also had to do Halsted radical mastectomies. We couldn't even think about doing a lumpectomy and other less, terrible treatments for breast cancer.
Right. Yeah, no, those are excellent points. It's such a problem, and it's a thorny one. I don't think it's given enough deference by many folks in many folks in the mainstream who seem to think that there's some truth machine that tells you wrong from right. But the history of medicine clearly shows that many people that are regarded as kooks, the gentleman who drank H. pylori and gave himself ulcers, right? The idea that ulcers were of infectious etiology, that was regarded as heretical. And look where we are years later. So no, it's certainly true. But here's the somewhat of the flip side, right? So it's become clear to me over the last, I don't know how many years, 3, 4, 5 years, that the mainstream journals or the mainstream experts, the New England Journal of Medicine uses its perspective page to extol the virtues of Medicaid expansion, value-based care, pay for performance, all without a tremendous amount of evidence. They just it's ideology that's an opinion that's put onto the perspectives page, and folks read it and think that's the Bible. JAMA, as an example, would appear to be much more likely to highlight evidence that less medicine leads to better or equivalent outcomes, whether it be imaging or screenings or whatnot. So there's clearly obvious that there's some type of editorial bias when you're looking at the mainstream media, and I could go on and on with other journals. But do you think that you and the AAPS are susceptible to the same type of thing? Meaning, is it helping at all by being a loud mouthpiece for one particular brand of ideology? You have Fox News on one side, you have MSNBC on the other. Neither of them are helping. It's just a cacophony of noise.
Well, I think that there is you can call it an ideology. That's kind of a pejorative term. Or you can call it a philosophy that founded our country, that believes in individual rights and individual freedom, in your ability to innovate and to keep the fruits of your labor. Or you can have the philosophy that we need central government, we need central planning, we need socialism, we need redistribution of wealth, we need to take what you earned and give it to somebody the government thinks is more valuable. I mean, these are two opposing philosophies. They cannot both be right. We think that slavery is wrong and freedom is right, and it just so happens that the mainspring of human progress has been the freedom of enterprise, the freedom to innovate, and so on, and that a lot of bad ideas have come along and they've been wiped out when a better idea comes along. But if you have the government saying, we know what's right and you're going to do it our way or else, then you're going to have disaster, just like we have seen over and over again.
Jane, I want to just give a plug to the conference that you mentioned just a few minutes ago that APS holds every 3 times a year or so. I think it's called the Thrive Not Survive.
Yes.
Conferences. I attended one of them 10 years ago. It was my ticket out of the morass of the healthcare system. So I'm eternally grateful to APS for holding these and showing me the way. And so we'll link to that. We'll have, of course, the link to the APS. We'll link to a very important show that we had with Lawrence Huntoon a few weeks ago, describing the work of the APS, that the APS does, defending physicians and helping physicians who are falsely accused by hospitals in their, in a sham peer review process when the doctors are inconveniently whistleblowing or telling the truth about what's going on in the hospital and so forth. So I want to thank you very much for all the work that you do. It's very challenging. You're taking risky positions, controversial positions, and not everybody will agree on all of them. But as you said, freedom is a dangerous thing, and it's an essential thing. And without it, it's very hard to conceive of making any progress ahead. Your Twitter handle for people who are listening who may not go on the show notes is
at Jane Orient.
Hey, Jane Orient. Thank you very much. Any final words you want to tell our audience?
Well, thank you so much. I just think that it's very sad that freedom should be a controversial and dangerous idea to promulgate. I mean, we know that freedom has risks and so on, but to say that you are controversial by saying that doctors and patients should be free. I mean, what has become of our nation?
That's true. And to that point you have, and I'll link to that actually, because I think it's very good. You have, the APS has put out I think it's a declaration of patient rights, right? The patient has the right to choose their doctor, to do this, and all the government interventions, all they do, they restrict and restrict and restrict patient freedom in the name of healthcare. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you.